We're going to show you how to make this amazing bioactive, naturalistic, live planted chameleon enclosure out of this broken, old, decrepit Reptile enclosure. And this is how we do it. So the first part of this build, we have to get this enclosure out, put it in the middle of the room so that we can get all the way around this enclosure so we can truly inspect every little aspect of this enclosure, find out where all the holes are, where all the repairs are, and find the easiest way and the most reliable way to either repair these holes or to cover these holes, just to make it safe for when the animal does go in there. We are planning on just doing a full background build throughout the whole sides and the back of this build, so that's not going to be too much of an issue because it will get covered up by the back panel pieces. The first step, just to avoid any further damage, we're going to have to get the door off this enclosure. It just comes off with a couple of screws on each hinge, and we put the door somewhere nice, safe and secure. Now the next step is to clean out the enclosure, get all the logs out of there and measure both the side panels, the back panel and the front base panel, because we need to cut the polystyrene sheets to fit those locations. We then have to transfer those measurements over to the polystyrene using a marker and a straight edge. To do this, we're going to measure twice and cut once. We're not cutting, we're going to use a hot knife and run the hot knife along the lines that we have already made onto the polystyrene sheets. This ensures an extremely snug and tight fit. This big sheet of polystyrene, it was an 8 foot by 4 foot sheet of polystyrene. It only cost me £8 from the local Home Depot, and it goes a long way with all the other enclosure builds we do on this channel. We decided to cut away the top corner of the side panel. One, because the polystyrene just wasn't big enough to start with. Number two, it allows for a little bit of extra airflow throughout the enclosure. With the other side panel, we actually didn't have enough polystyrene left. We only had this small triangle piece. So we decided to cut it to the right length and see how high we can actually go with it and see what we can actually make out of this background piece. We then had an off-cut triangular piece which we placed onto the top, and that seemed to fit that design quite well. The next step will be to secure the background to the enclosure itself. However, this is a mesh enclosure. The way we're going to do it, we're going to brace the inside of the enclosure, forcing the background to the mesh side panels. We go on the back side of the background and silicone on top of the mesh, and then force the silicone through the mesh holes. That way it adheres to both the mesh and the background panels, and the more silicone you can get onto it, the more secure it's going to be. Allow it to dry for the acquired time. Once that has cured, it's time to lay the enclosure down on its back, remove all the bracing that you did put inside the enclosure, and start laying out the log work. See where you want the log work to go. Find the suitable positions where your animal's going to be able to utilise the logs to get close to the UV lighting that will be on the top of this enclosure, and just place the logs in such a way where it looks good, ready for the expanding foam. We have these little fibre plant pots. We're going to place them and dot them throughout the enclosure. We're going to be adding plants into them eventually, but at this stage we like to get them secured in place in the background. Then we start shaking up the expanding foam. The expanding foam that we're going to be using is an external use only expanding foam. The joy with this, it doesn't have to be anything special. You just have to allow it to cure for the correct amount of time to make sure all the chemicals are burnt off and it is fully expanded. We lay this across the back corners of the enclosure, around where all of the logs meet the side enclosures, around all of the plant pots, and then we let it cure for the acquired time. Now you may be looking at all these logs and think, can I just use any old logs inside this enclosure? Well, let's rewind to 3 months ago when we came out to the forest and the lake to try and find some sticks. Just look at those cute ducks just sat there loving life. You only want to take hardwood when you are out here. That's oak or beech, they're the ones I tend to stick to. You only want to take wood that has already fallen on the ground and has been fallen for quite a while. It's got to be from an area where there's no fertilizers, no insecticides, no pesticides, no dog urine, no dog feces. So make sure it's a bit of an unladen path. So go off into the forest and then go deeper into the actual forest. So that basically eliminates all farmland, anywhere where they're potentially going to be growing crops of any kind, where they're likely to spread any sort of fertilizers. It also eliminates places like country manors, parks, children's areas, outdoor areas where they're going to be spraying and keeping on top and maintaining the land. You don't want to get rotten wood, because rotten wood just harbours loads of bacteria. Just for example, there's a nice piece just there, piece of oak. It has fallen, it's not rotten. You can also get tons of oak leaf litter from around these areas too. Hardwoods just take a lot longer to actually decompose within the enclosure. They're a lot more firmer, a lot more sturdy, they're going to last you an awful lot longer. And plus you can get to some amazing locations just like this. Once you have got these home, there are two main ways that you can actually prepare these to make them safe to go inside your enclosure. Option number one, you can bake them 180 degrees Fahrenheit for around about half an hour. Keep checking on them so that it doesn't cause any fire risk. Option number two, you can freeze them for a couple of days. Just whack it in the freezer. That'll do exactly the same, kill off all the bad bacteria. Once that is done, just get it out, give it a nice good clean, and then it is safe to go inside your enclosure once it has cooled down to room temperature. We then add holes into the bottom of this big tub. We're going to be using this as a big planter because we do have a big weeping dew plant to add into this enclosure. Again, we secure this in with expanding foam. We have to leave the expanding foam to cure for the acquired time. For this expanding foam, it's external use only. It takes over 24 hours to fully cure. As you may have seen with one of our last build videos, our salmon pink bird eater enclosure. We actually set that one on fire because we were stupid enough not to leave it for the acquired time to cure. If you want to see that video, I'll link it in the top corner now. It's time to stand the enclosure back up onto its feet and admire your work. Starting at the top, we've got a big planter or two over that back corner just there. We've got a number of big perches there where they can really rely on without having to use too much muscle strength to actually support themselves. We've got some uprights there and some there. We've got ones that run from the bottom all the way up to the top. Now we will be adding a few more into the bottom substrate layers that will come up to this perch just here. This perch is mainly for the animal. If he wants to get out of the UV rays, he'll be able to go underneath the plant growth that will be out of this big planter just here. We've got more planters over the back corners and over there. We have got a double planter here that we plan to turn into one by cutting the middle piece out just there. It's slowly coming together really nicely. Now we need to start carving. The first part to carve is this piece just here that joins two of the sticks to actually together. To do this, we're literally just going to grab it and peel bits off. This will eventually be covered by silicone and substrate to help blend it into the actual background material itself a lot easier. We now have to start the tedious task of carving the entire background. To do this, we've got a big knife, a little knife, we've got the little blowtorch if we do so feel the need to use that, and we've also got a razor scraper. We're going to start off by cutting off the big chunks first. Now I love chameleons, they've just got such a personality and they do such quirky things. What does your pet chameleon do and what's its name? Once they're all cut off, it's time to start really shaping the enclosure. You can get all the curves where you want, all the textures where you want, and just go ham on the expanding foam, make it your desired design. You have to make sure you get all the shiny surfaces off, simply because the coats after this won't adhere to the shiny surface. Unfortunately, the expanding foam does dry shiny, so you do need to attack every little inch of the expanding foam. This can be a tedious job, and once you get sort of halfway through, you start to think, oh, I wish this would just speed up, and then you start getting sloppy with the work that you are doing. That's not what you want to do. If that does happen to you, just like it did to me a few times with a few of our other enclosure builds, just take a step back, have a cup of tea, then get back at it once again. But soon enough, you'll be able to step back and admire the work that you have done. Now on this build, we did notice we've got an awful lot of flat, empty, pretty featureless side panels. So we're going to cut up some extra piece of polystyrene sheet into random shapes. We're actually going to shape them using the blowtorch, and it just helps secure all of the polystyrene balls into the actual material itself, making it less loose. We're going to give it a bit of a texture on it with the blowtorch as well, and then adhere it to various spots on that side panel using silicone. This just adds texture and depth to that relatively boring side of the enclosure. It also helps to make anchor points for the vines that we will be adding into this enclosure later through the video. We then quickly run the blowtorch over the entire flat surface just to add a texture to it. We also do this to the blunt edges of the polystyrene side panels. Then we clean out the enclosure and start working on the material we're going to use to cover the entire background of this build. Now this is going to be a 3-step process to be able to cover this background safely, because we are adding heat into this enclosure. There is going to be UV light as well, so we do need to protect all the polystyrene, styrofoam and expanding foam from that heat. The way we do that is we mix up a plaster substance. The plaster we're going to use is external use only, and we are going to be using quite a lot, adding quite a few layers. We need to mix it 2 parts plaster powder with 1 part water. We're actually going to add a little bit more water than we should do to make it that little bit more runny, so that plaster does get into every little tiny nook and cranny on this background build. We lay the enclosure down on its back and start spreading the plaster substance throughout every little aspect
of this enclosure build. Again, this can be quite tedious, but it does need your full attention. You need to be able to get into every little speck of this enclosure to help protect it from any heat that will be added into the enclosure. We then lay the enclosure down on its side and do exactly the same on the side, allow it to cure for the required time, then flip the enclosure back onto the other side and do that side as well. This isn't the first coat we're going to use, we're going to do 2 coats on this background piece. The plaster for the second coat will be made a little bit thicker, just so we can add a bit more texture into the flatter surfaces of this enclosure. And with the second coat, we like to add a colour into the actual plaster mix so that it can just give that naturalistic background colour to the enclosure. The way we do that is just simply adding in acrylic paint. Acrylic paint is non-toxic even when it's under heat. But once that has been left to cure for the required time, it's time to move over to stage 2 of this background design. That's where the paint comes into play. We're going to be covering the entire background in a black acrylic paint. This is going to be used as a base coat to build off later through the video. Now you really do need to get into every nook and cranny solely because this is the base coat, this is the shadow colour of the background. So if you do find that when it is cured that you have got some little areas that are showing through that you really did want covering, just go back with a smaller brush and dab over those various areas and make sure it's covered. Once that has cured for the required time, it's time to start using a dry brush effect. This is where we get our paintbrush and we shorten the length of the bristles, making the bristles a little bit more stiffer. We load the paintbrush with just a minute amount of paint, but then we rub the majority of it off before we go into the enclosure. We then brush it onto the background build very quickly so that it doesn't get into all the little nooks and crannies and it really starts to show the texture of the various background pieces. We start off this one with brown, moving slowly down to the lighter colours, finishing off in white, which will be our highlight colours. Again, only using acrylic paint and allowing it to cure for the required time between each coat. Now the background does look extremely good as it is right now and can be extremely functional as it is right now. However, we like to go the extra mile, so cue in stage 3 of the background build. For this you're going to need some cocoa fibre. You can either use the brick and expand it in water, or you can buy it ready made already. We like to put this into the oven. Our cocoa fibre was a little bit damp, so putting it in the oven just dries it out because the substrate does need to be extremely dry for this next step. We have marine grade silicone, which is aquatic safe, so it's safe to go in with the reptiles, and we slowly start patching little bits throughout the entire enclosure, only working at small bits at a time. Once we've put one little small piece in, we put the cocoa fibre into it, pressing it in and leaving it to cure. We do this through various parts of the desired background just to add for that extra dimension and naturalism throughout the entire enclosure. You can cover the entire background, or you can do little aspects like we are right here. Leave it to cure for 24 hours, brush off all the excess, and that is your background complete. We next take off the front panel of the enclosure and cut a piece of plastic to fit where the mesh would naturally be, and we silicone that into place extremely securely. This is going to help keep the hydro ball, the drainage layer and the substrate within the actual enclosure. We silicone that whole panel back into the enclosure and then silicone all of the edges throughout the entire bottom of the enclosure, making sure it's going to be good enough to withhold the substrate layers. And while that silicone's being left to cure in the bottom of the enclosure, it's time we can start moving on to the top of the enclosure. Before we start planting the enclosure and doing any extra decor, we want to install the thermostat probe. That way when it is installed we can work around it to be able to try and hide it within the enclosure. We're going to put a small hole in the background of the enclosure that goes right through the back mesh and out into the natural world in the back. We're going to thread the thermostat probe through that enclosure and place it to where we want the temperature to actually be recorded. We're going to secure the thermostat probe with cable ties. That way when it comes around to planting the enclosure we can hide the cable ties and the thermostat probe with the plants. For this enclosure for a chameleon we're going to be using a dimming thermostat. Any hole that is left around the thermostat probe hole we fill with silicone and substrate. Then we secure the thermostat to the side of the enclosure, and all of the products you can see us using in this video will be linked in the video description down below. It's now time to make a nearly free, naturalistic looking vine to go into this enclosure. I won't bore you with the details on how to actually make these vines. We have done a video on it in the past. If you'd like to see a video on how to make these, totally free, naturalistic, they dry hard and they look naturalistic, then click on the video link in the top corner of the video now. We secure it to the side of the enclosure using stainless steel screws so they won't rust over time. We cover the screws in silicone, then another dab of substrate over the top of the silicone just to hide it, make it look like a little bit more natural. Now comes the bit that I've been dreading because I'm really not that good of a craftsman. We're going to be making a wooden light box to go on top of this enclosure. We got inspired to do this by the Reptile System social media accounts with their new paludarium. They've done a similar thing on top of their paludarium. So we're going to start by measuring out 2 foot lengths of this big decking board, remembering to measure twice and cut once, cutting them using the jigsaw, drilling pilot holes through the wood so the wood doesn't split when we do put the screws in eventually, and then making the traditional box that the lighting will fit in. Up to now this has taken well over 200 hours and way more money than I could have ever imagined. I'd really appreciate it if you did hit that thumbs up button, it would really help me out. We then cut another length down in half into 4 foot lengths and secure them against the wall so that we do have something to fix this box to. We drill 3 holes into the wall for each upright. We also put silicone on the back of the pieces of wood and then secure it to the wall via the screws. We add in some wooden supports within the box. That's there to secure the lighting when the lighting does get installed into this enclosure. Some eye bolts into the box and into the wall. We then install the lighting into the new light box that we have just built. We're going to be using the Zone 3 Eco T5 unit by Reptile Systems for the UV lighting, and then we're going to daisy chain off that unit onto another Eco T5 unit that's been installed with the New Dawn LED plant grow light. That way when the timers turn on, both of these lights will come on. We'll have our plant grow and our UV. We have to leave space for the dome light that will be for the heat source in the middle of these lights, and we'll be fitting the dome and the heating further through the video. And then secure it into place using rope. Ideally we'd like to use chain, but it doesn't exactly fit in with the naturalistic look that we are going with this enclosure. Then we secure the bracket that's going to be holding the dome light eventually. We then lay some sheets of Repti carpet down onto the floor. That just adds for a little bit of cushioning in the bottom of the enclosure when it is full of substrate. We put the enclosure back into its location, plug in the lights and give it its first test run. Now you're going to be getting a first look at the lights the same time as me at full reaction. We'll turn the studio lights off. We'll head over to the lamp itself. Find the toggle switch. Are you ready? Whoosh. Whoa. Oh, look at how beautiful that is. You can really start to see the colours pop. You can really see the textures on the background. That is stunning. Now time to move over to the substrate layers of this enclosure. For the drainage layer we're going to be using BioLife drainage filtration. This is the medium sized one and we're going to use a couple of bags in the bottom of this one. First of all we need to wash it because it does come extremely dirty and dusty, and we don't want that dust to be running in the enclosure or in the humidity that's going to be within the enclosure. We then need to put it all in the bottom of the enclosure, and this acts as a drainage layer throughout the bioactivities part of this enclosure. We're using 2 bags in this build. We then spray it all down, level it all out in the bottom, and then measure out and cut a window screen mesh to go over the top. This is a barrier between the substrate layers and the drainage layer to not allow any substrate to go through into the drainage layer. We lay that on the top and then it's time to start sorting out the substrate. Now the substrate we're going to use is our own blend of a substrate. It's our tropical mix. We have done a video on it in the past. It's an absolutely amazing substrate. It's really cheap to make with all the components that we do add into this substrate. It holds the humidity within the actual substrate layers itself, slowly dispersing it throughout the day, so you're going to have a constant humidity for those higher humidity species. It's absolutely amazing for plant growth. It's got loads of bioactive matter built in with it. It's just an all-round amazing tropical substrate. If you want to know how to make it, I'll leave a link in the top corner of the video now. And while you're there, why not hit that subscribe button? We're always coming up with unique, cheaper ways of keeping reptiles. For planting this enclosure, we've got a big weeping dew plant. That's going to be one of the main features throughout the background of this enclosure. We've got a wide variety of various different bromeliad plants to go through. We've got some foliage plants. Now this plant is going to grow excessively quick and excessively fine. It's going to carpet quite a lot of the background. So we want to add that in a various few different places throughout the whole enclosure. We've got some plants with bigger leaves. They're going to go into various different places just to help add a bit of dappled light down from the lighting that is above this enclosure. We're going to start by doing the foliage in the top of the enclosure, working our way down towards the bottom. The foliage goes in the top, so over time that will expand and cover the background and drape down the sides of the enclosure too. We're going to add some bromeliads throughout the enclosure along various different spots. These are great for holding humidity because the water cups up inside the bromeliad and slowly allows the water to evaporate over time, providing a general humidity throughout the day, throughout the whole enclosure. We're going to drop the big weeping dew plant straight into that pot. Now this one was a challenge to get it out of the pot, put it in the new pot, trellis all the vines throughout the enclosure. We were surprised at just how big this had actually got, and we did have to take quite a bit off this to allow it to fit into the enclosure really nicely. We dot a fair few other plants throughout the enclosure, along with these cork bark bits that we did silicone onto the enclosure to allow for extra bromeliads to be placed throughout the enclosure. We then give everything a really good watering and let it settle in for a few days before we start doing any sort of manoeuvring. You'll note that some of the bigger leaves that are just pointing down, like the weeping dew or the pothos plant, they will start to point up towards the plant grow light. To which, after 3 days of leaving it, all the weeping dew plants have started to point upwards just like we said. But throughout those 3 days we also noticed we don't get too much of a light dapplement through the layers, so we're actually going to change the lighting into 2 different LED plant grow lights in the top of the enclosure instead of just the one. We're going to use the rotating brackets by Reptile Systems and the New Dawn LED lights. That way we can angle the lights in whichever direction we actually want to, achieving a bit more light down the bottom layers of the enclosure. We then install the Reptile Systems Black Edition clamp lamp with a halogen lamp plugged into the thermostat. We then installed the Swell Reptile rain system and drip system into this enclosure and then tested it. We then installed the Swell Reptile fog system and tested it. We refitted the door onto the enclosure. We added the cleanup crew into the enclosure. We programmed all of the plug-in timers so they come on with a slight sunrise and a sunset. Programs the heat to come on and off as and when it should do. So ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce what I consider to be the world's first mesh screen enclosure that's fully bioactive, fully live planted chameleon setup. This has been a really hard build. Please hit that thumbs up button. If you're new around here, please subscribe. I'm going the pub.